after the 2016 Democratic primaries, there was a wide range of calls for reform within the DNC, and they did institute some, at least nominal, reforms, one of which was a mandate issued by the DNC central apparatus last year for states to broaden their standards for participation in primary contests. Now, there had always been controversy about caucus states in particular because a caucus is distinct from a primary in that you have to go and physically remain at a voting location, sometimes for over an hour, maybe even 2 or 3 hours. And that means that people with disabilities or elderly are less able to vote. And there are also plenty of people who work who can't take time out of their schedule to go and spend an hour plus caucusing. So as a result of this mandate issued by the DNC last year, many states transitioned from caucuses to primaries. Now, that's an added expense for those states because a primary is run by the state government, as with any other election, so taxpayers have to underwrite it. And a caucus is held by the party, so they're essentially private or quasi-private affairs. But to comply with the DNC's mandate, states like Maine, Colorado, Washington, Idaho, and others transition from caucuses to primaries. So this upcoming cycle, this can be the first time in those states where you simply go into the voting booth as you would on any typical voting day and vote for the Democratic nominee. But a few key states have held out and are going to continue with caucuses, namely Iowa and Nevada. And those two states are extremely important because they come first and third in the primary cycle. So one thing those states attempted to do to comply with this mandate for broader access to their contests is institute what they've called virtual caucuses. So they've given an option where if you are a registered Democrat, you can download or use some kind of application on your phone to cast your ballot, so to say. Now, it should have been pretty apparent all along that that was going to come with it many complexities, because although caucuses are run by the party, so it's a private or quasi-private organization, the general public basically looks at a caucus in the same way they look at a primary. I mean, they expect the same standards to apply. So because there's such paranoia now, especially within the Democratic Party, about hacking and foreign interference and that sort of thing, to institute this brand new virtual caucusing option would have been a little bit complicated in terms of ensuring to the satisfaction of all observers that it was run in a competent and error-free manner. So in the case of Iowa, for example, campaigns had already begun to incorporate the virtual caucusing component into their overall strategy. This was decided by the Iowa Democratic State Party this spring that would be a component of their caucus. So you already have presidential campaigns who have made long-term calculations on the basis of that option being available. And the same goes for Nevada. But then, almost out of the blue, a few days ago, the DNC met in San Francisco, and one of its committees voted to reject the virtual caucusing proposal by the state parties in Iowa and Nevada. And I think there's a point about this that's worth highlighting for its irony, because the DNC ostensibly wanted to increase participation in their primary contest, which is, all well and good. I actually think that there are competing arguments that you could weigh about the utility of caucuses in particular. I don't think it's on its face necessarily bad for a party to use a process that is a little bit more involved than just a simple primary in selecting a nominee, where you have to go to a caucus, you have to, in some cases, barter with your fellow citizens. Somebody goes and makes an affirmative case for each candidate. People change their mind over the course of a caucus. And it's kind of like democracy in action, not to use a cliche, but there is something I think worth preserving about that. And sure enough, outsider candidates have tended to overperform in caucus states, especially in the Democratic primary. So, for example, Bernie Sanders overperformed in caucus states in 2016 and won even in some that you might otherwise have expected to go to Hillary. And even in states that maybe might have been a little bit more naturally inclined towards Sanders, his margins were increased in the caucus states. So now it's going to be a little bit of a complexity for him, given that many of those states have now transitioned to primaries, because caucuses privilege organizational prowess, right? That's one thing that I think is legitimate to give some kind of priority in a primary process. If you can put together the organization required to get people out to the caucus, where they're sort of equipped with the arguments necessary to convince their fellow citizen about why a particular candidate is the best choice. I don't know. I think there's something that's sort of admiringly deliberative about that. And even though, in theory, there are people with disabilities and maybe elderly and such who can't necessarily participate, some states have a fusion of a caucus and a primary, which I think might be a reasonable balance to strike. But nonetheless, the Iowa Caucus remains central to the primary because Iowa is first, and by tradition and custom. So they use this virtual caucusing option to satisfy the mandate that was set forth by the DNC. And the irony is that option has now been scuttled because of the DNC's maybe excess paranoia about hacking and foreign interference, etc. They're using the experience of 2016 now, when many of them believe that they were egregiously harmed by Russian state actors or whatever the current narrative is. It's almost hard to keep up. To now override the attempts by two of the early states to comply with this participation mandate. So, in effect, in practice, the over-exaggerated concern with all manner of hacking and this paranoia that has become so deeply embedded in the party has now caused them to shunt aside their demand that participation protocols be expanded. So that actually turns out to be, in practice, what has been the result of that paranoia, which is, I think, ironic. It's not what they would admit to, I don't think, but just look at the results. I mean, they had to grant a waiver now, or they're saying that they are going to be granting a waiver to Iowa and Nevada, so they actually do not have to comply with the participation mandate issued by the DNC, so they can retain their first in the nation status, or in Nevada's case, third in the nation. So after all that, after all this hand-wringing about hacking and what they can do to expand the scope of who can participate in the primary contests, ultimately they just have to grant a waiver to those two states, and they don't have to do anything particularly to expand the participation protocols. And that's a result of how fixated, unduly, so many in the party have become with this scary specter of hacking. Now, is there a legitimate reason to think that those protocols or those virtual caucusing options might have been compromised in some way? Yeah, sure, but the Iowa Democratic Party is fairly competent. You'd think that they would be using the appropriate vendors. They insist that everything was smooth sailing on that front. And if the DNC it was so concerned about quote unquote hacking, then why did they sort of acquiesce to that virtual caucusing option for many months, and now just all of a sudden decide to terminate it? There, as with many aspects of this Russia story, and the foreign interference and hacking meme more broadly, there are many layers of irony here, and one of which is that the end result is that the primary process will be just as will lack just the amount of inclusion as it had before, and that's a direct function of the DNC's paranoia in this regard. Remember, there was no hacking of any voting systems in 2016. There was no even really alleged hacking that has any legitimacy, meaning nobody of any sound mind has actually alleged that any aspect of the 2016 electoral process was seriously hacked in a manner that would have changed any results. But because of apprehension about that fairly remote possibility, they're now going and saying, Nevada and Iowa could be just as exclusionary in terms of their caucus as they've always been, and there's no difference. So keep an eye out for more ironies of that kind, because I guarantee you there will be many more. All right. Talk to you later.